Welcome to Sewing Club. Hi, I'm Charlene Mila from the Sewing Palace in Helena, Montana. And today I'm going to be showing you how to make this beautiful Holiday Medley wall quilt or throw. So let's get started by talking about the products that you're going to need today to make this quilt. The quilt is made with our Accuquilt machine and special dies. We use number one, the Holiday Medley die, which includes holly, snowflake, and a tree. And you can see those are all three incorporated into this quilt. And we also use the 6-inch Accuquilt block to make our block right here. So when we cut all of those with our die, which I will show you in a moment, you can make this entire quilt. What else are we going to need to make our quilt? Well, we're going to definitely need best press to press our fabric out so that it's nice and stiff and easy to work with, especially as we run it through the Accuquilt. Also, we're going to need this 14 by 14 wool pressing mat, which really assists me in side-by-side my sewing machine, doing all of my pressing right next to me at my sewing machine, so I don't have to jump up and down from my sewing machine. We're also going to use a 6.5-inch by 6.5-inch Creative Grids ruler to then cut all of our blocks to the same size before we assemble the quilt. And we also have for you today too these special kits that we've put together with all of our trees and holly and snowflakes pre-cut for you. So if you wish to already have them pre-cut because you don't own the die, but you do have an embroidery machine, we have some kits for you to make that very easy. So those are really the products that you need to make this quilt. So let's get started and let me explain to you all the pieces and parts and what we need to make this beautiful holiday quilt. Let's talk about all the components that you're going to need to make these quilt blocks. Number one, we're going to be using the 6-inch die from Accuquilt, as you can see down here. And we have 4 different dies that we're going to be using to make the quilt block, which looks like this. This is the red and white quilt block that I have made. So in that particular block, you're going to be using a 2-inch red, which are for the corners. So you're going to use a 2-inch square. And you're also going to be using some half square triangles. Those are a 1.5-inch half square triangle, which we have a template for, a die. And we're also going to be using the square on point 2 5/8-inch square for the center piece. And then we also have 4 rectangles in this particular pattern, and that is a 2 by 3.5-inch cut on one of our dies. So all of those are in the 6-inch to make this particular piece. Now remember, you can make this or any of those dies, you can make on the 6-inch, 8-inch, 9-inch die, whichever die you have. So you can make it as big as you want if you want a bigger block than a finished 6.5-inch block. The other die you're going to need is this one right here, which is our Holiday Medley die. And that has the snowflakes and the trees and the holly in it. So you can see all of these up here. You're going to need 8 snowflakes. You're going to need 8 trees cut out and 4 pieces of holly with some of the red dots that go with your holly. And so all of that is part of what you're going to cut on your Accuquilt. And our next step is going to be show you how we do that and what the process is. Okay, our first step is to do the fusibles, is what I'm going to choose to do, is to do all the pieces that needed to be fused on our quilt. And as you can see from the quilt, the fusible pieces were all the trees, the snowflakes, and the holly that we're going to applique during embroidery onto our pieces that are going to go in each one of those squares. So the first thing we're going to do is back all of those pieces that we need to cut with the Accuquilt with Steam-A-Seam 2, which is a double-sided fusible. Now I have torn the paper off the back side already, so there's paper on both sides of that fusible. You take it off one side, lay it onto the back of your fabric, and then iron it onto the back of your fabric. So that will fuse onto that fabric and give you the ability to fuse that onto each one of your blocks for your applique pieces, okay? So once you have gotten all of those fused, then you're going to cut them into blocks, which is what I did. I cut them all into blocks so that they would fit right over the snowflake on the die okay, for our holiday die. So you place them right on top of the snowflake. We're going to lay the pad on top of the Accuquilt die, and we're going to run it through our Accuquilt machine to cut out those snowflakes. So when I pull off the plastic on the top, I have my snowflakes all cut out and ready to go. Now you can do about 3 layers of each one of these fabrics when you have put the steam-a-seam on the back. Normally you can cut like 6 layers of just fabric, but as long as you're putting the steam-a-seam on the back, then you should do 3 to 4 at the most as you run it through your die. So the next step then would to be cut out all of the pieces that we need for our squares. Now those you do not need to fuse because we are just sewing those together. So in that case, you're going to take strips of material, and the pattern is going to tell you what size of strips you will need. So I've got a strip here that's going to fit right here over these blocks. Now I've got 4 blocks that are going to cut from this die, so I need a larger piece so that I can get 4 at a time. And then I'm going to flip it back and forth. I'm going to kind of layer it like thus so that I can cut it twice as I go through this die. Now again, you can put up to 6 layers of fabric when you're going through the die to do the cutting. So 6 layers of just fabric that's been put together, and you will see that all of those pieces then come out here all cut for you and ready to sew together. And it doesn't matter that you're flipping it back and forth because they're just the squares, and they all are just going to be red when you're finished, okay? So you're going to do that with all of your red squares. You're going to use all the different dies, the other 3 dies to cut your white pieces, and then you'll have all the pieces you need for your blocks. So our next step is to sew our blocks together for the quilt, and we're going to start with the center of the quilt. We have the on-point square and 4 half-square triangles, and we're going to sew 1 on each side of that on-point piece, and then we're going to sew 2 on the other side. So once you sew the first 2 on the sides, please make sure you press your blocks. You always want to make sure you're pressing your blocks as you sew so that you keep your blocks as straight and clean looking as possible. So now we're going to lay the other side, the other 2 pieces on, and let's sew those on. And you can see with your cut with the Accuquilt, your pieces are so accurately cut, they lay beautifully together, and it just makes for a perfect piece, and everything is nice and straight. All right, so we're going to press again, and we have our center piece for the quilt square. I love having it right beside me with this wool mat because it makes it so much easier. So the next piece is to take 2 of our rectangle pieces, of which we cut 4, and we're going to sew them 1 on each side of this center block. So let's do that next. So one on the second side. Again, I'm going to press those before I put the side pieces on. So now your side pieces are going to be 2 of the small squares and 1 rectangle. All right, so there's our side pieces. We're going to make 2 of these pieces, and then we're going to sew it onto the first piece that we put together. Okay, we've gotten one side of our quilt, of our square put on, and now we have to do the last side. But one of the things I want to make sure that you watch for when you're sewing this together is that when you sew the end pieces, you're going to iron to the center so that your red is going to go to the center. So you're not pressing to the dark, you're pressing to the light. They nest well so that when your finished product is there, everything lays nice and flat, because your center pieces need to be pressed out in order for your whole block square to lay nice and flat. So you always want to make sure that your seams where you nest them together are perfect there, so everything lays nice and flat. So let's put the last side on. Nicely done. We've got everything nice and squared, and our points even match, which is what we want to see when we have our squares put together. So now that we've got our squares made, let's talk just a little bit about the applique squares. So here are 2 of our applique blocks, one with the tree on it and one with the snowflake on it. Now you can do the snowflake. This is all done with applique from Accuquilt. I went onto their website and got the embroidery that they have designed to go with their dies, and they perfectly match up with all of the shapes that you're going to be putting on your quilting. So I have laid the tree, for instance, down on my 8-inch block here, and then when you begin the embroidery process, it will walk you through the steps of laying down your fusible piece, and then after it does a placement stitch, and then it will do the embroidery for you. Now in the previous 2 months, Kathy and I have done a number of shows showing you how to do the placement of these particular embroidery pieces with Accuquilt. So if you want to know that process, please go out to YouTube and watch her demonstration. For instance, last month with Sewing Club, we did it. And then again, she did another piece just on showing you how to do the embroidery placement. So once these blocks are all done, you want to square them up. So these were cut, all of your embroidery pieces were cut with an 8-inch block. So I'm using a 6.5 by 6.5 square, and I'm going to visually place it right in the middle using my square, and then I'm going to trim with my rotary cutter all the way around to end up with blocks that are 6.5. These blocks are almost perfectly 6.5 when you finish up, but you also have to square them up just to make sure all your sides are even. So you will then square up all of your blocks, both embroidery and the ones you have sewn together, before you start sewing your rows together. So let's take a look again at the quilt as it's put together. You have all of the rows going across, 7 rows across. You're going to put each row together before you sew each of those rows to each other to make the entire quilt. You have 8 blocks that are trees. You have 8 blocks that are snowflakes. And then the rest of the blocks are all of the red and white blocks that you have put together to go in between those. The center block, as you can see right here in the middle, was done with the holly. In the picture on the pattern, you will notice they used 4 pieces of holly with the red dots for the berries in the center. I chose to put the word Noel in the middle, and I did that with my embroidery module by just using my alphabets. So you can change up that center block if you wish to. And you also want to look on the patterns that I put up in the trees. You can see there are lots of different tree stitch outs. And I put a lot of different ones in this quilt just so that as a sample in our store, you could see what they all look like. So here's some close-ups on the snowflakes so you can see how pretty the stitching is for those. And also some of the trees. You can see what the outside stitching, the star on top, and some of the ornaments look like. This one has tinsel and beautiful tree lights. Another one on this is just green. There's no lights or anything on the tree or ornaments. And this one, again, with some of the pretty stitch outs. For the center, you could do just holly. Here's their block, just using 4 holly with the berries in the center. I want you to have fun putting this together. Once you get all your blocks together, all you have to do is make your borders, cut your borders out, put it all together and bind, and you have a lovely Christmas quilt. Holiday Medley die number 55043 available here at the store. And on the Accuquilt website, you'll find additional patterns like this one that I'm showing you, along with this Christmas tree quilt. I hope you've enjoyed our show for today, and thank you for joining us from the Sewing Palace in Helena, Montana. I'm Charlene Mila.